It's now 9 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thank you so much for attending the 2021 edition of Online Northwest. Before we get started, we just wanted to do the land acknowledgement for Portland State University, which traditionally hosts the in-person event for Online Northwest. Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on: the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Again, thank you all so much for attending. My name is Diana Castillo. I'm an instruction librarian at Oregon State University and a member of the Planning Committee. Other members of their Planning Committee are Robert Monge from Western Oregon University, Jeremiah Kellogg from Eastern Oregon University, Michelle Desilets from Portland State University, Gabrielle Hayden and Nina Fox from University of Oregon. Just to briefly provide an overview of what today will look like, shortly we'll be hearing from Dr. Scout Calvert from Michigan State University for our keynote. Then we are going to have a short break, and then we'll start splitting our conference along the two tracks, the technological solutions and the teaching and instruction track. The teaching and instruction track will be located in this Zoom link, and then you were also sent a Zoom link for the technological solutions track as well. Feel free to switch between the two tracks as you want. You're not confined to any one of them. And with that being said, I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Scott Calvert. Dr. Calvert is the data librarian at Michigan State University Libraries. Her recent projects have traced the social aspects of data-centric knowledge production in lay communities of genealogists, livestock breeders, and citizen scientists. Dr. Calvert also investigates data and metadata practices in libraries and among academic researchers, exploring emerging research methods afforded by new forms of data and informing data policy issues in academic libraries. This month, Scout concludes her term as a visiting program officer at the Association of Research Libraries, where she has been investigating emerging technologies and practices with positive and transformative potential for research and learning. Her presentation today is titled Library Futurisms: Interoperability, Adaptation, and Resilience. Join me in welcoming Dr. Calvert to Online Northwest.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Shall I go ahead and start?
Yes, and one last thing I forgot to mention before I get started, we will be having a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions at any point, please pop them into the Q&A panel, and I'll be monitoring that. And then once the presentation is over, I will be moderating the Q&A.
Great, thank you. Are you still able to see the slides that I've shared?
Yes.
Great. Everything always goes a little bit wonky when you're showing in Zoom. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the honor of speaking to you today. I really appreciate the privilege of your time and attention today. We're going now into the 14th month of the pandemic in the United States context, and my heart goes out to all of us for what it is that we've been enduring and what it is that we've lost. Thank you also for the land acknowledgement. It's always helpful to hear those for other places that I am, even though I am not there with you physically. So I want to actually start with some of my conditions of possibility by acknowledging the lands that I've lived on. and the support for my very being that these lands have provided. I'm speaking to you today from Michigan as an affiliate of Michigan State University, which is on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. MSU also has the dubious distinction of being the first land-grant university, which is to say it was the first of many universities to be built and funded by the appropriation of native lands. I was born and raised in Arizona on Yavapai Apache territory, which is this image here, where my grandparents and great-grandparents were miners and cattle ranchers living from the land. And I speak to you who are primarily in the Pacific Northwest, where you live on traditional territory of dozens of other tribes and nations. And I encourage all of us to become familiar with our histories and our collective conditions of possibility. So the practice of land acknowledgements is related in general to the question of what comes next and to the specifics of my talk today. It's a core tenet of standpoint epistemologies that we locate ourselves and give an account of our conditions of possibility as necessary context for our knowledge production. And it is my intention to further the work of decolonization and advocate for Indigenous sovereignty, including knowledge sovereignty through my work. So as part of that, I'm going to try to be cognizant of my audience and the we that I speak to in this talk. Presumably, you in the audience are library people of all kinds, mostly with some kind of connection to the Pacific Northwest. And in this talk, I will name and assume that while most of us are descendants of white settlers, not all of us are. And so I hope to avoid taking that kind of sameness as a given. And this is important because how we constitute our we is a problem for library futures, because it's about who is in the room when we make our plans and design our systems, identify our problems, and then choose how to devote resources. It is about how we become interoperable and how we answer the question of what comes next. So in the earliest days of the news of the novel coronavirus, I read some advice about getting ready for a pandemic from epidemiologists who had been through it before. They wrote, "Our goal is to survive not just as individuals, but as a society." And that goal has been sorely tested in the last year. Still, as we upended daily life and work routines, the pandemic has provoked these questions and others. What is most urgent to keep doing? What must we stop doing? What can we stop doing? And what must we resume to do when it is safe to do so? So some of the things many of us have been happy to stop doing include things like commuting, going to the office 5 days a week, wearing pants that don't have elastic or wearing pants at all, attending meetings we don't want to go to, or working on business hours. And last summer, people spoke out to say they were no longer going to accept police killing with impunity. So we've also learned that social change does not have to be gradual, and thus we can have less modest goals for addressing urgent social problems. The sudden onset of the pandemic displaced other urgent matters, most obviously climate change and resource inequality in the public's attention, but also shows that the attention of billions can be brought to a single point when the problem is imminent and acute. The disruption of the last year illustrated a key lesson from science and technology studies that is crucial for library people and library scientists. The maxim that all technologies are adopted in social contexts that shape their uses, development, and potential. You can read more of this from Shoshana Zuboff. So identifying our role in what comes next and how we will use technologies to get there is a future-oriented activity. To meaningfully address that question involves vividly imagining potential futures, so vivid it's as though we are remembering them, and then working backward to identify the steps needed to get there. From potential available futures, it is the work of all of us here today who are library people of some kind or another, who are interested in technology, to close doors leading to some futures and open doors leading to others. We do this whether we mean to or not in our technological choices, as organizations generally and as knowledge organizations for the public in particular. Imagining and articulating visions for the future will make it easier to know what to do in the face of challenges, and it has become even more urgent to engage in bringing some futures and not others into being in the face of this pandemic, global inequality, and climate change, and the attendant problems that arise with those. We also have local commitments to the inclusion of all of our constituents and local histories and justice projects that are being tested by the current disorder. And all of these are intimately linked. So in this talk, I draw on the tradition of science fiction or speculative fiction that has been adopted in a variety of creative, philosophical, and aesthetic communities, including in feminist strains of thought and others that we may call queer futurisms, Afrofuturisms, indigenous futurisms. In these movements, creators may craft alternative futures and sometimes alternative pasts in order to imagine social and socio-technical worlds organized differently than what may seem to be available to us now. In some, visions of vibrant futures are rooted in actual pasts. In others, creators imagine how worlds would be different if events had gone differently, marking the future as Black, as Indigenous, as queer, and writing Black, Indigenous, and other people of color into the future, thus unmarking the future as only white, gender normative, and containing only European nuclear family groups in our collective imaginations. So an example many of us are familiar with is Black Panther. So that's both a comic book series and a blockbuster feature film that imagines what future possibilities the uncolonized nation of Wakanda could offer for the African diaspora. And careful readers of the Black Panther universe know it is not perfect, and Wakanda is not a utopia. This is a promotional image for the Kickstarter project Coyote and Crow, a role-playing game set in the near future where the Americas were never colonized. In this image, Adrienne Marie Brown invites all readers to think about the present we might inhabit had reparations for slavery been enacted in 1865. Donna Haraway's Camille stories envision a deepening of kinship ties and an end to compulsory reproductivity in a small community organized around averting the extinction of the monarch butterfly and living well through climate change. When my 7-year-old saw me working on this presentation, she asked, "Why do you have a picture of Coyote and Crow?" And when I told her, "I'm talking about people who envision different futures to get through times that are tough," she said, "Oh, like She-Ra." So the futurism of the She-Ra reboot also figures a collective hero. Futurisms vividly imagine radically different futures, some of which we may bring into being, some of which we may wish to bring into being. In our work as practitioners of technologies for libraries, we can make our visions of library futures congenial to the alternatives envisioned by diverse futurisms movements. We can and must do this without appropriation, without treating as ownable property the ideas of others in order to allow ourselves to be changed by those ideas without trying to take credit for them. Instead, in libraries, we can begin by articulating a vision of abundance against fears of austerity and making our visions malleable, responsive, and open rather than appropriative and acquisitive. This is part of what I mean by interoperability, which I will turn to shortly. So the matter of library futures is urgent, but organizational responses are constrained from the start because we take the problems as identified and articulated through the dominant culture as givens. We accept those on their face. And so the problems we face seem to be about constantly dwindling resources and the decreasing belief in the relevance of both libraries and society. And that is within the context of unfolding climate catastrophe and mass extinction event that has been called the Anthropocene. But who is framing the question? We do not have to take these as givens. Knowledge can only be enclosed or commodified when it is locked into containers. What happens when the containers themselves are part of the commons? Speculative futurisms can unsettle assumptions and reframe the questions. When we, and here again I want to mark we as a library community constituted largely by white people and descendants of settlers, when we try to address the question of resilience in the face of global pandemic and the sixth mass extinction, we would do well to attend to the values we've proclaimed about justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and notice that our actual community includes many people for whom these times are not unprecedented. We, that is, the library community, is historically constituted and containing, but in actual reality containing many more, can learn from people who are living through devastating pasts and presents, people who are among our colleagues and constituents. And we can create visions of the future through which, despite the horrors of the past and present, we empower ourselves to address issues of social justice and equitable distribution of both resources and drudge work. The history and sociology of science and technology show that we are constrained, but nothing is finally determined. We can imagine a future organized around different means for sharing power, knowledge, and resources, then work to make it possible. And we can't know in advance if any of this will work, but we do know that we do not have to continue doing what is not working. Interoperability as a quality of technical systems is a resource for envisioning future library technology, and it's a metaphor for how we engage with each other and the communities to which we are or envision ourselves to be fundamental. Interoperability is transparent design that allows heterogeneous actors to understand and build complementary systems and to plug into and allow for cooperation at a variety of scales and intensities. It is both a metaphor and a commitment in library practice. For example, part of the work that standard systems like Dewey Decimal Classification, Library of Congress subject headings, and MARC have done for library practice is allow us to cooperate, to share labor, to build technologies together. They have also embedded exclusions into our technological and organizing systems, into our very knowledge systems. Engaging in library futurisms licenses us to envision dismantling and rebuilding these systems and the systems that allow us to interoperate without being, while being alert to the reinscription of the exclusions and violence of the histories that we inherit. Technological dependencies mean we build on the installed base of prior technologies. So new systems will necessarily contain parts of the old, because that's what we have at hand to work with. But we are capable of continually learning and revising in the face of new understandings and new voices. For interoperability to fully function as a generative metaphor for library science practice, it must address the question of how we constitute our we. Who is understood to be a rational participant in conversations about library practices and technologies? Who is understood to be part of the constituency that is our audience, our patrons, our colleagues? And with whom will we endeavor to interoperate? Interoperability, open standards, and shared knowledge are intimately related to the questions of knowledge enclosures and colonization. The history of libraries in the West has been to collect or hoard knowledge in its many containers: scrolls, clay tablets, books, databases, or other objects. In the past and into the present, this has sometimes been achieved by deception and conquest. It is only a relatively more recent practice to provide access to this knowledge to wider audiences than just those in power. Attendant to the problem of hoarding is that of appropriation and knowledge colonialism. Together with our cousin organizations, galleries, archives, and museums, libraries may have in our holdings materials that were acquired by conquest and deception, and we, as a field of knowledge and practice, are coming to understand we should not possess or share. What we do about that is a conversation to be had with the people whose materials we hold, and we cannot control the outcome of these conversations. In order to become more adept at interoperating across differences of many kinds, library practices in these futures will recognize a wider range of knowers who are heard to speak within library science. That is to say, interoperability depends on open standards that are subject to revision through shared knowledge and conversation, without appropriation and without knowledge colonialism. I want to take a moment to reflect on the work that notions of adaptation and resilience do for us. So adaptation is an evolutionary concept, and it expresses how organisms change to survive in the environments they live in. Unfortunately, many of our beliefs about evolution have been warped by social Darwinism, by the view that survival of the fittest means survival of the morally best. And we saw that attitude have deadly consequences over the last year as social policy was shaped by the belief that we should ignore the risks of the pandemic to the most vulnerable. Community health disparities in turn fueled high mortality rates in many communities. For example, the Navajo and Hopi Nations in my home state of Arizona, and the communities of Detroit here in Michigan. The belief that health state is a moral status is eugenicism, and the pandemic provided an opportunity for fascism to be expressed through our social priorities. So adaptation and fitness are not signs of moral virtue. In the history of evolution, we also know that organisms co-evolve, can live together symbiotically, can become part of a new whole through symbiogenesis, and that while some individuals may be able to survive for a time isolated and separated, that humans are social organisms, and human survival is social survival, and we're not separable from our environment. So as we contemplate how we might adapt, keeping human and other earthly relationships close is a necessary strategy for not merely surviving, but also flourishing. The related notion of resilience is also fraught. When this word is used, it is often used to imply that individuals lack the psychological resources to withstand privation and oppression, rather than to identify paths to healing and resistance to structural inequity and violence. It individualizes societal trauma. But I understand it, and I choose to read it in the conference theme as being both worried and aspirational about our collective ability to withstand difficult, traumatic, painful events and conditions of privation and lack. Many of us have already experienced this. Many of us are experiencing the pandemic and various kinds of hardship. And among us in this conversation are people who have experienced or whose families have experienced historical trauma of genocide, enslavement, dispossession, impoverishment, and disablement. So conversations about adaptation and resilience can quickly become fantasy rehearsals for what we would do in an apocalypse. And fantasies of apocalypse are often about wiping everything away that has already happened and starting over. And that's another lesson from speculative fiction. These fantasies can have the seed of genocide in them. So instead, we must understand that apocalyptic events are already happening for some people and animals and habitats on this planet, that they are ongoing, and that people are surviving. And we do not have the luxury of starting fresh. Resilient adaptive libraries then, in my view, will be those that have worked toward interoperability by being inclusive and responsive to their constituents. As we worry about catastrophic events, be they fast like the pandemic or slow like climate change, we should think about our most precious relationships and social practices. These are what we want to continue existing into the future because they sustain us and bring us joy. When we begin naming those things, we can begin to see that they are largely immune to austerity. From there, we must name the essential functions of society for flourishing and protect them in our visions of the future. When we name what is essential, we know that knowledge, stories, and cultural expression are part of what we name. That is why engaging with futurisms and reprogramming our imaginative capacities away from the deadly fantasy of a blank slate is so vital. Through these stories, we can learn from people who have experienced this historically while decentering colonial perspectives in our imagination. Even the Vovolini arrive with seeds in the most recent installment of Mad Max, once the monster trucks are out of the frame. So I want to turn to 4 findings of a research project I've been working on with the Association of Research Libraries. With a disclaimer that I speak to you as a librarian and a scholar in my own right, and so my views do not represent those of ARL. So there are 4 aspects of technologies and technological practice we've identified as crucial for research libraries to engage with. They are openness, collaboration, digital fluencies, and data infrastructure. I will consider each of these 4 things and its attendant library futurism one by one. So the first is openness, open access, open standards, open systems, open source. In this library future vision, interoperability as a goal for building technical systems across and within library practices, interoperability as a metaphor. Openness works both ways, as people who do not work in libraries can access standard systems and engage in their own revision. Teams are open to different necessary technical and non-technical knowledges. More ways of being become visible, and we appreciate difference, not neutrality. We eschew dehumanizing rhetorics as incompatible with genuine interoperability. Collaboration, facilitated by open standards and interoperability, knowledge and cultural organizations work better within and across institutions. Work better reroutes productivity gains to qualitative improvements in work satisfaction. With enhanced interpersonal capacities for working together and cherishing difference, we appeal to people's intrinsic motivation to do our work well. Our products are better because our process is better. We distribute both drudge work and opportunity equitably across all job titles. We learn from team science and human-centered organizational development. We attend to and reduce power differentials that shape who can say what in our organizations. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and anti-racism meaningfully transform libraries. Digital fluencies, understanding the ways our world is co-shaped by our technologies, our ways of knowing, and the traces we leave in the digital world. We understand that there are many uses for technologies and that they are shaped by those who adopt them. Thus, we insist on developing and buying technologies that embed library values related to privacy, intellectual freedom, appropriate sharing, stewardship, and interoperability. We define the parameters of those values with a wider range of knowers than in library sciences past. We build and demand transparent and fair algorithms and data sources as a public resource and utility in every instance when their use is non-optional. We inspect technologies with cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural groups because no single person can do it alone. We assist different communities in adapting technologies in culturally specific and sensitive uses. And we understand that constituents will exceed our expectations for how technologies can be used. We do not demand sharing or ownership of private or sacred knowledges. We know we are enriched when we give back the things that are not ours to keep. Data and data infrastructure. We build collections and tools that allow us to use computational power to the benefit of our constituencies. We build data infrastructure through open standards and collaborative endeavors, and collect data that is produced as a public good through social systems like science, public funding, and shared technologies. We recognize that data must be documented, that is, all knowledge claims have context. We recognize a wider range of knowers and knowledge. In data sharing, we commit to a partially shareable representation of reality. The data are observations of the portion of reality that's shareable, and accountability to data practice is requisite. We recognize group consent for research and human subjects protection beyond the individual, and that not all data is ours to share. Guided by interoperability and openness, we freely license life-saving knowledge of medicines and technology for use by others. So in my library future vision, we sever the imagined tie between information and computing technologies and that which is cold, sterile, masculine, white, analytic, hard, and impenetrable. In practice and actual use, people of all ages and backgrounds use technologies as they please for a variety of creative intellectual, and cultural pursuits. In actual practice, the use of technology is messy and heterogeneous. We question and rework the social systems that make intellectual property and copyright a matter of the ability to make a living for some and the ability to control and close and make a killing for others. It is a matter of social organization that we allow some knowledge to be privately owned and controlled when it is about life and death. That is a choice. It is not an inevitability. So openness is a value that we work towards so we maximize the benefit of new knowledge produced through access to current knowledge and with public support. And we recognize a wider range of knowers because library systems are open and interoperable, some distinctions between kinds of library constituents and colleagues become less important over time. In my technological futures, libraries are fully integrated with their communities because we've eliminated artificial separations between knowledge producers and curators and knowledge consumers. And we steward, but we do not need to police. In this future, we don't fear technologies because we build them together, though through power-sensitive processes that are alert to many kinds of harms. So the disruption of the pandemic has shown us that much of the current social organization is arbitrary, and that when we choose to prioritize different things, options that had not seemed possible before, in fact, emerge. So suddenly accommodations could be made. Suddenly we could trust people to work from home. Suddenly we could lend digital copies of print material. Suddenly we could stop evictions and make some kinds of healthcare free. It has also thrown what matters into stark relief. And we've learned that our relationship with others and the environment matters even more deeply than we knew before. So the development and enhancement of technologies to fill that gap has been rapid, and it's been amazing, and it's also been stopgap. But it should prompt us to ask, what other problems could we meaningfully address if we treated them like a moonshot or like a pandemic we were trying to stop? If we were willing to disrupt our lives and take climate change seriously, for example, what might happen? Futurism recognizes the current context and constraints, but does not set our trajectories by beliefs that are stagnant and inherited from the powers that be. So while we're constrained in actual fact by our economic and judicial contexts, those contexts do not ultimately determine the future. Thus, library futurisms are open, our invitation to unburden ourselves from our beliefs about what we thought was possible or impossible in order to imagine a different and perhaps more just future that libraries are part of making possible. Then remember that future so vividly that we feel compelled to bring it into being. And so the questions I leave you with as an answer to the question, what comes next? What do we want to keep doing? What do we want to stop doing? What must we stop doing? What must we resume when it is safe to do so? And what are we willing to do to imagine we can make possible? So thank you. It is a very strange experience to not hear any of you. So I hope you're still with me.
Thank you so much, Scout. I really enjoyed that. Just a reminder for folks who want to have questions, please use the Q&A feature. I'll start us off since I'm not seeing anything. In your closing, you mentioned that we should steward but not police. And I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate on that and how we as librarians can do that in practice, particularly moving forward once the pandemic starts to lessen and we start returning more to in-person operations.
Yeah, that's a good question that we're going to all have to answer. And so as I start, I want to let you know that I'm going to share the slide deck with everybody, and there actually are references at the end that will point to some of the things that I've said. But I don't actually answer that question, or I don't actually provide a source for that. But I am thinking a little bit of, I think it was somewhat new for people over the summer to rethink policing and to engage in the question of like, well, what does it mean to abolish the police, right? And some people saw that as like a real threat, but other people said, no, this is about putting the money that we use for policing to other things. And so in a library context, a lot of our the ways that we relate to patrons and how they use books is from a time when books were more expensive and hard to get, right? And so a whole host of practices and attitudes evolved from, you know, having limited budgets. We were at the sort of the relative beginning of industrial publishing when books were relatively expensive and not the, you know, the same kind of commodity that they are today. And so in the past, we've had attitudes about what how patrons should behave, you know, either with the books or with other materials or in the library as part of that emerged out of that history. And we don't have to do that anymore. So, you know, just for example, we as a profession can get our hackles up when someone challenges a book, right? They'll go into a library and say, this book shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be in the children's section, or, you know, it's about sex, or it's about drugs, or whatever it is. It's about trans people. And we get our hackles up about that. And of course, we don't want censorship of those kinds happening. But we also don't really let the public know that the people who remove the most books from libraries are librarians, right? And we do it for a number of reasons. The book is worn out, it's not circulating, or we never purchased it in the first place because, you know, implicit biases that we didn't even know we had, or it never got through the publication process because, you know, because of the way that the publishing industry reinforces norms, right? So we really can like step back, and I think, you know, and then there's the material, the actual material reality now is that books are relatively cheap. So we don't, and we see, we can accommodate wider range of behavior in libraries as well, right? Not everyone needs a quiet environment. Some people actually effectively read and enjoy knowledge together in small groups, right? So all of that. And so I'll finish by saying it. I think there's some quote, I want to say it's from Adrienne Marie Brown, but she also might have just surfaced it from conversations she's in about, you know, the policemen in our imaginations. And are sort of like when we have a first urge to like tamp something down or stop something from happening, try to just sort of step back and say, well, is that an arbitrary thing, or is there really someone being harmed here? And so to stop doing that and to steward resources, especially digital resources, you know, in a way that we take care of those, and then we don't have to worry about what people are doing with them anymore. So I hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you. We have a question from Elliot Stevens. Scout, are you a fan of Anna Singh's work, like The Mushroom at the End of the World or The Feral Atlas? She writes a bunch about capitalist destruction and collaborative survival within multi-species environment, and your keynote is making me think about that and make new connections.
Yeah, 100%. And so if you love reading academic stuff, Anna Singh is an anthropologist, and actually she's a professor at where I got my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, and I absolutely love her work. And it is so like, I wanted to tell you so many things today. It was really hard to get this down to half an hour, and the multi-species, you know, component is really relevant to all of this, right? So, and the futurisms, like imagine, like, you know, imagine if we just sort of have that, you know, well, in the pandemic, we understand as well that how we have been engaging with, you know, animals is part of why we have this, right? But then there's many things in that chain, but it's really, the multi-species part is also really close to my heart. In my other research, which is in animal studies. So I spend a lot of time thinking about animal or human bovine relationships. And I would say that if there's only one Anna Singh piece you're going to read, is maybe start with A Mushroom at the End of the World. I read parts of that in draft at the time, because when she was writing what was called for years the Mushroom paper, she couldn't find any place to publish it. And so that's been 15 years ago now, or a little bit longer. So yeah, it's really wonderful. And thank you, Elliot, for the opportunity to elaborate on that.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes, so if there are any other questions for Scout about about her keynote, please submit them. I'm looking through my notes to see if there's a question I can ask while we wait. Did anyone from the committee have any questions? I'm putting you all on the spot. And thank you, Scout. So if folks want to see the slides, she just put the link in the chat, so you should be able to access that.
You can also ask a question that's just say more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in just thinking more about the like different types of futurism. So you had mentioned indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism. And for me, just thinking about how to incorporate that into how we conceptualize libraries moving forward, and how that might require some radical changes, and how we traditionally view libraries and how they operate.
Yeah, I expect, I think the overlap, in my experience, the overlap between library people and fan communities is pretty strong. So I'm sure there's lots of people in the audience who read widely in some of these areas. And so there's lots of people who can tell you really good stuff to read. And one of the things that I appreciate about reading fiction, which I don't get to do enough in my life, is just the way it subtly changes me. And, you know, so there's a sort of analytic piece of reading people who are actively talking about, you know, things like prison abolition, or how we can, you know, survive into the future in nonfiction ways. But there's the way also that when I read fiction, I just, I'm able to just sort of open my mind in ways that I hadn't realized, or I hadn't realized that I'd taken something for granted. That just, you know, I feel like I'm a slightly different person after reading it. So I think there's a lot of ways to engage it in reading that's not necessarily in a didactic mode of what can I learn from this, but just reading widely and like being open to like, oh yeah, the things that we have taken for granted aren't necessarily like fixed the way we often think they are. And I think that's, you know, been the big lesson of the last year. So, you know, I think, and I guess that's a sort of practical thing that we're all grappling with right now. Well, I don't know. Every library seems to have done it slightly different. My library did figure out how to keep almost all of us working from home. So my suffering was not economic. But now we're going to be in conversations as we hope the pandemic is winding up in the United States, and it really won't be done until it's done everywhere, right? But as the pandemic winds up, we hope, and we might be back in our buildings. Well, in the past, libraries have been really, you know, insistent that you be there 9 to 5, or you be there certain hours, and you clock in and you clock out, and you have your 40 hours a week. But that hasn't always been similar workplaces around technology haven't always done that also, right? So people who've worked in other non-library, non-university settings in technology have been able to work from home, work more flexibly, work hours that are more amenable to their body clocks and so on. And so I think that we will be having a profession-wide conversation about how, not only for the benefit of our constituents, but for the benefit of everyone working in the library, that we can be more flexible in those kinds of things. And I think that's a really basic place that we can start, and we've just had the proof of concept that it can work. So, and from there, you know, maybe the sky's the limit, or maybe it's not.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, I agree about the reading diversely, and just as a way to rethink some of our assumptions. And I definitely get that after I read someone like Nnedi Okorafor or Rebecca Roanhorse, particularly her recent fantasy book, Black Sun, was just an amazing, for me, like rethinking of how epic fantasy could be constructed and how we can rethink some what we think of as traditional fantasy narratives. So I'm going to do one more question from Kristen Buxton, and then we'll wrap up and scatter to the different tracks. So they ask, what's bringing you hope these days?
Well, I was about to say I'm in Michigan and it's really dark here, but some of you are probably in Washington. So Michigan just has like the next lowest number of cloudy days each year. So spring is bringing me a little hope, and it's amazing how, that is so chemical and intense. The uprising of last summer has been hopeful. It's been very painful for a lot of people. But that has brought me hope. Seeing so many people in libraries thinking about, both like, how are we going to make it through and help other people in the pandemic, and then how are we going to maybe stick to some of the things that we've adopted in the pandemic, and that is, more flexibility on working from home, really applying ourselves to figure out more digital lending, right? Because people now will take that for granted, that they can, we have all of these legal restrictions around it that we're going to have to push harder on and rethink. So that's hopeful. Sorry, I want to. I realize I'm going to have to, for myself, do a mental inventory, because I'm not always as hopeful as I should be, but I think, or that I think I have cause to be. So I think more people talking about as well. The one thing that the uprising of last summer did is, for better or worse, in libraries, people are like, oh, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And actually, I saw libraries use the words anti-racism, right? And many libraries condemned the murder of George Floyd. And that's been a move away from a principle of neutrality where we're just pretending none of that exists. And so I think even naming that, I think we all feel a little bit squicky about it, like it's just, mouth noises, but it makes other things possible. It makes it, when the directors in libraries say things like that, it makes it possible for other people to start saying things. The problem is, like, well, the things that get said in public and in public statements, and then the things that happen privately and in meetings where that gets backpedaled, or people get punished for saying the wrong thing about it, for being too outspoken. But just in general, things like that, where we're getting some people's attention, and that makes a little bit more room to do other things. So I think it does always feel like a struggle between, forces pulling us in one direction and forces pulling us in the other. But I do think that that we collectively haven't given in, and that, I think, is maybe the most helpful and hopeful thing of the last year.
And I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. Thank you again, Scout, for providing our keynote and providing us with, I think, a really great start to our day. So before we go on break, just a quick reminder, this Zoom link is going to be hosting the teaching and instructional track, which will be, the first presentation will be the challenge of dual credit, creating sustainable library learning experience. And the second track, which is going to be hosted by U of O, is the technological solutions track. The first presentation, when the questions have answers, leveraging online reference to understand user experience. And with that, I am going to